Well, lots of moving parts. We're joined now by two guests to dissect and analyse all of this. Mohamad Elmasry is a professor at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. He's here with me in the studio. And Anthony Lowenstein is a journalist and author of the Palestine Laboratory, a book on Israel's arms and surveillance industry. He joins us from Sydney. Gentlemen, good to have you with us here, both in studio and in Australia on Sunday morning. Mohamad, can I just begin with you first? 24 hours ago, I mean, we sat here and we spoke about what might happen, the reaction that could happen. What do you make of Iran's response and the bigger issue of whether Israel might again retaliate to what's just happened?
Yeah, well, as I said yesterday, it was pretty much inevitable that Iran was going to respond in some form. The question was, who exactly would respond? Would it be Iran from Iran, or would they respond through one of their affiliates in the region? There was also the question of what that response might look like. Obviously, now we know. I think, for the most part, this was a performative act. Iran knew that Israel's air defense system would be able to intercept those drones and the few missiles that were sent, that were fired along with them. So Iran is sending a message that we have a deterrence capacity, that you shouldn't strike us in this manner. And if you do it again, then there will be a stronger response. Where we are right now is in this kind of tit for tat. We're in this kind of danger zone where we don't know exactly what Israel is going to do. They may take the U.S.'s advice and stand down, or they may further escalate.
OK, let's bring in Nancy Lowenstein here as well. Let's just develop that. You know, what could Israel's response be? We have this war cabinet meeting later in the day, and there has been talk even within the cabinet, certainly from the right-wing elements of the cabinet, to respond again. And this is what the US doesn't want, but it's certainly a dilemma for Prime Minister Netanyahu.
And in some ways, what's happening in the last 12 hours could very much play into Netanyahu's hands. What I mean by that is that domestically in Israel, he's deeply unpopular. He's increasingly unpopular in the US, obviously, although the US's actions speak differently. They're obviously still giving weapons to Israel for its massacres in Gaza. But this is a long-term plan of Israel and many of its allies across not just the region, but frankly around the world, to what they view as defanging Iran. That they see Iran as the centre of all problems in their view, and this is a great distraction from what's happening in Gaza, which I note in the last week, for the first time really in 6 months, you have some, including some right-wing Israeli commentators, saying that the war in Gaza has been a disaster for Israel, let alone, of course, Palestinians. I mean, what could Israel do in response? Israel could obviously continue what it's been doing for years, which is striking Iranian military strikes, targets in Syria. It could actually strike Iran itself. I mean, Israel has been striking inside Iran for years, killing Iranian scientists. So an escalation could well happen. The concern, I think, is that much of the US administration, I would argue, still does not want an all-out regional war, which frankly many in Israel do.
Anthony, is the US and Washington between a rock and a hard place at the moment when it comes to not just talking with Israel, but negotiating with its cabinet about the way it's conducted its war in Gaza, the way it's dealing with its regional neighbours, because it's really ignoring even its strongest allies of Jordan and Israel, who recognise Israel, and then we have the Iranian cog in this very complicated set of wheels that's going on right now?
I mean, Israel is ignoring them, but ultimately Israel knows that, at least thus far, no one is cutting ties. In fact, the opposite. I mean, all the nations that are sending weapons, principally the US and Germany, are still sending weapons. And I think a lot of Arab countries around Israel also know that, yes, they assisted Israel and its so-called defences in the last 12 hours with Iranian missiles and drones coming into Israel. But the fact is that none of those Arab states have cut ties with Israel, and none of them will, I would argue, because they're so reliant on Israeli surveillance technology and repressive tech. And I think ultimately Israel is not, people sort of argue that Netanyahu becomes this sort of rogue figure. In fact, the fact is, in Israel itself, Netanyahu is not popular, but his likely replacements are remarkably similar. There is very little difference. And I think what's happened in the last 12 hours obviously is concerning, but frankly, what we need to have is massive international pressure on Israel not to unleash a potential war against Iran, which many in Israel have wanted for a long time.
OK, Mohamad, let's just bring you back in here, because that is the real worry, isn't it, for Washington, D.C., as well as European capitals and, of course, the neighbourhood around Israel. They do not want to see an Israel-Iran clash on a very large scale. This may have just been a token tit-for-tat scenario.
Right. No, I think you're absolutely correct. And I think Anthony is also correct. I mean, where we are right now is largely because of Joe Biden. Benjamin Netanyahu has succeeded for 6 months in taking Biden by the hand and walking him down almost every single rabbit hole after October 7th, whether that was adopting the Israeli talking points, even the absurd myths about beheaded babies, or UNRWA being effectively a terrorist organization, or systematic rape, obviously the funding of the genocide in Gaza, the support at the United Nations. And now, even though the United States does not want a war with Iran, a direct confrontation with Iran, here we are with the United States using its air power to shoot down Iranian missiles over Israel on behalf of Israel. So again, the question remains, to what extent is Biden going to continue to be used in this way by Netanyahu in ways that I think everyone agrees do not serve U.S. interests and do not serve Biden's own personal interests? He's on the road right now to losing this election to Donald Trump in November.
Yeah, but he has to keep an eye, doesn't he, on Netanyahu. Netanyahu has this wonderful way of saying to the Israeli public, I am defender of the country. I am the one that can control this situation. And by engaging Iran, certainly in the way that Israel has in the past 14 days, is he not feeding into that narrative? Will it work with the Israeli public from where we're sitting at the moment and the way we've been observing the Middle East?
Let me be clear. I think these last 12 hours are a victory for Netanyahu. Notice what we're not talking about today. We're not talking about aid getting into Gaza. We're not talking about the massacres in Gaza. No one in Israel is talking about the hostages anymore. Everyone's talking about what happened with Iran, right? And so this is the distraction that Netanyahu wanted, and we're seeing sympathies now in the Western capitals be reversed. They were critical of Israel, they were condemning Israel, and now they're embracing the Israeli narrative once again.
Anthony, let me bring you in here. You were nodding as well, in agreement. I suppose you can only agree with Israel so far at the moment, as the public will most probably in Israel, until the bombing continues again in Gaza, because that isn't stopping. And once the Iran issue has settled down and the dust has settled down, everybody focuses back to Gaza, most probably because Israel hasn't stopped his assault on the Strip.
Far from it. In fact, the so-called goals that Netanyahu outlined on October 7, none of them have been achieved. The hostages have not been returned, mostly. In fact, it's pretty clear that many of those hostages are probably dead, if not all. And Hamas is still in control of large parts of Gaza. Obviously, they've been defanged to a point militarily, but they still control parts of Gaza. Much of the leadership still exists. And I think this really goes to a broader question of a long-term plan that many in the US, in the Republican Party, parts of the Democrats, and indeed much more conservative parts of the US. Although it's interesting, the last few months, the conservative movement is increasingly split on Israel. There are obviously some who are very, very hardline that support anything Israel does, but there are some, including, for example, someone like Tucker Carlson, who's hardly a radical leftist, who increasingly seems to be much more critical of what Israel's doing in Gaza and beyond. So the concern I think that many of us should have is that Israel has never known what restraint means, because they've never been restrained. And this is a classic example of, and I agree with what's just been said before me, that, you know, ultimately without some America or Europe, or frankly the Arab states, saying to Israel, you cannot begin some kind of regional war here, which nobody seriously wants. I mean, just finally, you know, Iran is economically very weak, and they know that. And they're also incredibly unpopular within their own country by many, many of their own citizens. And Iran, from my understanding, having been there many years ago, and a lot of Iranian friends will say, I don't think in the Iranian regime one can be deeply critical of them, as I have been for 20 years. I don't think there's any indication they want full-blown war with Israel, because it would be catastrophic for everybody. And frankly, it's unclear whether the Iranians would win. So no one wants that apart from a handful of radicals on both sides.
So let's just pivot then to the issue of Gaza right now, which is ongoing. We know that it's going to pivot at some time during the day. In the Israeli war cabinet right now, we've got Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, economy and internal security ministers. They're heavyweights. They're pushing for a much more stronger approach to the military assault into Gaza. We talked about restraint, that there is a very difficult job within the Israeli war cabinet now for Netanyahu, and he knows that America's on his back about this, as is Europe. And these two individuals and who they represent in terms of the Israeli diaspora are the people that keep him in power.
Absolutely. And I mean, ultimately, it's worth saying Netanyahu could fall as prime minister tomorrow. As I've been writing and saying for months, the likely replacements on these key issues, Iran, Gaza, the West Bank, the occupation, are remarkably similar because actually they reflect mainstream Israeli society, which is predominantly quite pro-war. There is massive pro-war sentiment within Israel in relation to Gaza, I'm talking about. And there's been little real understanding or really appreciation of the profound damage and strangulation and carnage that Israel has unleashed. If there's not understanding, there's also a great deal of support for killing Palestinians. The tragic irony about all this at the end is that Israelis are no safer at the end of this. When this ends in Gaza, hopefully today, tomorrow, Israelis are more unsafe. They're actually more isolated. Regardless of what happens with Iran, I would argue, much more isolated. If not in Western elite circles, certainly in the public in much of Europe and the US. That's the reality of 6 months of killing 40,000 predominantly Palestinian civilians.
There we will have to leave it for the moment. Anthony Lowenstein there for us in Australia. Thanks so much. Of course, Mohamad will be speaking more and unpicking it as the day progresses. For the moment, both of you, thanks so much.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.